What if the woman, once hailed by the world as a modern-day Cinderella, was concealing a truth so intimate, so explosive, that it had the power to shatter everything she had ever built? What if the seemingly flawless fairy tale surrounding Meghan Markle, the actress who became a duchess, the humanitarian, the devoted mother, was not the story we were all led to believe, but instead was founded upon a secret so profound that even the royal family itself may not fully comprehend it? And what if the man who once knew her more deeply than anyone else, her very first husband Trevor Engelson, has finally reached the point where he believes the world deserves to know this hidden reality? Before we move forward, take a moment to hit the like button, subscribe to this channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update. This is not some shallow tabloid whisper. This is not a recycled piece of gossip passed around for attention. No. This is a story buried carefully beneath layers of public relations statements, polished Netflix documentaries, perfectly timed interviews, and the unyielding silence of the palace. It is a story that took root long before Meghan ever crossed paths with Prince Harry, long before the grandeur of a royal wedding, long before her name became a headline across the globe. And it is a story that Trevor Engelson, the man who once walked at her side in the shadows before the blinding spotlight, now stands ready to finally unveil. But before we arrive at the revelation that would send shockwaves crashing through royal circles and reverberating across Hollywood, we must first turn back the clock. To truly grasp how everything unfolded, you must understand who Meghan was before the crown, before the global headlines, before the endless controversies. And just as importantly, you need to understand the man she left behind. The man who now insists that he was deceived about something so fundamental, so life-altering, that it shattered not only their marriage, but also his entire perception of who she truly was. In the world of Hollywood, Trevor Engelson was a name spoken with respect. He was not a household figure like Steven Spielberg or Harvey Weinstein, but within the industry he had carved out a solid reputation as a hard-working producer who had clawed his way upward from the very bottom. Trevor was not flashy. He was not consumed by the pursuit of fame. What he loved most was the craft of filmmaking itself. And when he crossed paths with Meghan Markle, a young actress still struggling to secure her first significant breakthrough, he felt he had finally discovered someone who shared his values, his drive, and his ambition. They were not a glittering celebrity power couple. They were partners, moving hand in hand through the brutal and unforgiving landscape of the entertainment business, or so Trevor believed. Their romance unfolded much like a classic Hollywood love story. Serendipitous encounters, shared ambitions, long conversations stretching late into the night about the dreams and futures they hoped to build. Meghan came across as charming, witty and intelligent, the kind of woman who made you believe that absolutely anything was possible. Trevor, on the other hand, was loyal, steady and deeply supportive. He believed in her talent. He believed in her heart. And when they finally chose to marry in the year 2011, friends and family alike remarked that they seemed to be the perfect match. Yet appearances can be deceiving. Even in those early days, there were faint whispers. People close to Meghan began to notice how carefully she managed the story of their relationship, how she meticulously curated the image that the world would be allowed to see. In Hollywood, image control is normal after all. Perception can mean everything. But with Meghan, it felt different. Every decision, every detail seemed almost calculated, deliberate, as though part of a larger design. Trevor, blinded by love and devotion, failed to recognise the warning signs that something was not entirely as it seemed. There were moments, small, fleeting moments, that in hindsight Trevor would later describe as unmistakable red flags. Offhand remarks Meghan made about motherhood that did not quite make sense. Conversations about the future that she avoided altogether. Sudden, sharp changes of subject whenever particular topics were raised. At the time, he brushed them aside. Everyone has boundaries, he reassured himself. Everyone has private matters they prefer not to discuss. But those private matters, the ones Meghan was so determined to keep buried, would soon become the fault line that split their marriage wide open. The marriage lasted scarcely more than 2 years before Meghan chose to walk away. In a move that shocked even their closest friends, she placed her wedding ring into an envelope and mailed it back to Trevor, a gesture so cold and final it left people speechless. There was no explosive argument, no headline-grabbing scandal, no dramatic betrayal, only silence. Meghan was moving on, and she had no intention of looking back. At least, that was the version of events presented to the public. Behind the scenes, however, Trevor was reeling. The woman he believed he had truly known had not only abandoned their marriage, she had walked away from the truth itself. And years later, after Meghan had married into one of the most famous families on the planet, that hidden truth would resurface with a force neither of them could have anticipated. Because recently, following a highly public incident that reopened old wounds, Trevor broke his silence. And in doing so, he revealed something so personal, so deeply entwined with Meghan's identity, that even her most steadfast defenders have been left grasping for words. He claims Meghan Markle may not be able to give birth, and that she has known this for a very long time. Now, pause for a moment. This is a heavy claim, deeply sensitive, profoundly controversial, and if true, it has the power to change everything about the carefully constructed narrative Meghan has built around herself. Yet Trevor is not speaking from thin air. According to those close to him, he has held onto this information for years, ever since the day he says he stumbled upon something that shattered not only his marriage, but also his ability to trust. For years, the world has speculated about Meghan's pregnancies. From the very moment she appeared with a baby bump as a working royal, the media swirled with conspiracy theories, some outlandish, others born of lingering unanswered questions. But Trevor's words have injected a new dimension into that conversation. This is not idle speculation from anonymous voices on the internet. This is a man who once shared her bed, her home, and her life. A man who says he knows the truth Meghan has fought so hard to keep buried. And it is not simply a matter of biology. At its core, it is about betrayal. Trevor insists he was never given the full story, that Meghan concealed vital details about her medical history. Information that, had it been shared, would have drastically shaped their marriage and their hopes of building a family. He describes the day he uncovered the truth as a devastating blow, a betrayal even more painful than the divorce itself. Imagine giving your love to someone, planning a future with them, only to later discover that the very foundation of that future was built on hidden lies. That, in Trevor's eyes, is exactly what happened. But here is the pressing question. Why now? Why step into the light after so many years of silence? Those who know Trevor best insist it is not about revenge. It is not about grasping for attention. Rather, it is about watching Meghan stand before the world and carefully weave a narrative that to him is not just incomplete, it is pure fiction. It is about watching her mould herself into the image of a devoted mother, a tireless feminist advocate, a victim of royal cruelty, all while holding back a part of her story that she has never been willing to confront publicly. And when a recent event, one that hit far too close to home, once again cast Meghan's narrative into the spotlight, Trevor finally reached his breaking point. It is important to emphasise that Meghan has never publicly addressed these accusations. She has chosen silence, as has Prince Harry. Buckingham Palace refuses to comment. Her public relations team brushes off every whisper of hidden medical issues as baseless gossip. And yet, the silence does not quiet the storm, it only fuels it. Because if Trevor's claims were completely false, why not crush them directly? Why not put an end to the speculation once and for all? And that brings us to the deeper, more uncomfortable question. What if Trevor is telling the truth. If he is, the consequences are staggering. It would mean Meghan deliberately withheld life-changing information from the man she once intended to start a family with. It would mean that her carefully orchestrated image as a modern royal mother is built on a structure of half-truths and omissions. It would mean that not only Trevor, but perhaps even the royal family and the public at large may have been misled about one of the most intimate aspects of her life. But this controversy extends far beyond Meghan's ability to give birth. At its heart, it is about control. Control of the narrative, control of public perception, control of the story itself. From her earliest days in Hollywood to her rise within the royal sphere, Meghan has consistently demonstrated a remarkable talent for shaping narratives. And if Trevor's words are accurate, that talent for manipulation runs far deeper than anyone ever imagined. The irony, of course, is striking. Meghan's story has always been portrayed as one of empowerment, a biracial American actress breaking her way into one of the most traditional and exclusive institutions in the world. A woman who would never be silenced, who spoke her truth no matter the cost. And yet, if Trevor's revelation carries any weight, then it forces us to confront a troubling question: whose truth was she really telling? This story holds weight right now because it slices through the layers of public relations gloss and palace-approved statements to confront difficult questions about authenticity, integrity, and trust. It forces us to move beyond the polished headlines and examine the individuals hidden behind them, not as fairy tale icons, but as flawed, complicated human beings, capable of deception and secrecy, just like anyone else. Most importantly, it reminds us that within the world of royalty and celebrity truth is rarely ever what it appears to be on the surface. Trevor Engelson is not a bitter ex-husband trying to relive old wounds. He presents himself as a man who feels deeply wronged and who now believes the world deserves to know the truth, whether the public chooses to believe him or not. His words have reignited one of the most divisive and controversial debates surrounding Meghan Markle. And as more fragments of this puzzle begin to fall into place, one thing becomes absolutely clear. The story you think you know is only the surface layer. Because what Trevor is prepared to reveal next does more than challenge Meghan's honesty, it exposes a hidden part of her past that was never meant to see the light of day. And once that truth emerges, there will be no turning back. What followed changed everything. And no one, not the palace, not Hollywood, not even Meghan herself, saw it coming. Because long before the crowns, long before the lavish palaces, before the global controversies and multi-million-dollar Netflix deals, there was simply a man named Trevor Engelson. And without him, the Meghan Markle story cannot be fully understood. Have you ever truly wondered who Meghan was before she became Duchess? Meghan before she transformed into a global headline? Before she held a platform powerful enough to rattle one of the oldest monarchies on earth? For most people, the answer is no. They begin the story at the royal wedding with the gleaming white gown, the horse-drawn carriage, and the cheering crowds lining the streets. But the real beginning, the one Trevor insists the world must hear, lies nearly a decade earlier inside a modest, cramped Hollywood apartment with no security detail at the door and not a single paparazzo in sight. It is here, within the overlooked chapters of Meghan's past, that the truth quietly takes root. Trevor Engelson was not a prince. He was not a billionaire. He was not even a household name. But he was real. He was the man who knew Meghan before the bright cameras ever turned toward her, before she learned how to control and manipulate a global audience, before the polished interviews and carefully scripted answers. He knew the Meghan who burned with restless ambition, the Meghan who talked excitedly about her big break over cartons of cheap takeout, the Meghan who cried after rejection emails, yet swore she would push through and make it no matter the press's ambition, odds. Their paths first crossed in Los Angeles in the early 2000s. At that time, Meghan was still a struggling actress, taking on small parts in medical dramas and even appearing on game shows to make ends meet. Trevor, meanwhile, was an up-and-coming producer with a sharp eye for spotting talent early. They moved in similar social circles, and when they finally crossed paths, the chemistry was undeniable. Friends who witnessed those first encounters recall the spark instantly, a connection between two fiercely ambitious people, both driven by hunger for something far bigger than the lives they were living. It was not love at first sight. It was something deeper, something sturdier. It was compatibility. It was the quiet but powerful feeling of we are in this together. Meghan, who had spent years enduring Hollywood's brutal casting grind, finally found someone who not only believed in her talent, but also in her resilience. Trevor, who had built his career with his own hands from the ground up, admired her persistence and tireless drive. They quickly became one another's support system. He opened doors for her, helping her network and navigate the industry. She, in turn, brought an infectious energy and renewed confidence into his world. Side by side, they were a team, two partners, building something from almost nothing. But ambition, as it so often does, revealed itself to be a double-edged sword. Those early years were filled with laughter, warmth, and intimacy. Yet, within the laughter, subtle shifts began to take root, small cracks in the foundation of their partnership that neither of them fully recognised at the time. Meghan started to change as her career slowly gathered momentum. Then came her big break, a coveted role on the television series Suits, and in an instant, everything changed. The woman who had once wept on Trevor's shoulder after rejection letters was now gliding across red carpets, posing for photographers and fielding interview requests. With that success came something else, a new version of Meghan. A Meghan who was no longer content with simply being one half of a team. This new version wanted more recognition, more influence, more status, more control. Trevor, still humble, still unpretentious, did not perceive the transformation as a threat. If anything, he was proud. To his friends, he often said he had always believed she was destined for something greater. Yet behind closed doors, others began to notice that Meghan's priorities were quietly shifting. Shared dinners grew rare. Cosy movie nights became infrequent. Conversations about their shared future dwindled. Meghan was now talking about the brand, about image, about strategy, and about what came next. And those closest to them began to ask the question Trevor never wanted to face. Was he truly part of that plan, or had he already become just another stepping stone? As the balance between them tilted, Meghan began making decisions on her own. She hired a new publicist. She widened her circle, surrounding herself with people who could push her career higher and faster. She even began attending events without Trevor at her side. When he questioned her about it, she brushed it aside with a casual smile. "This is how the industry works," she would say. "It's not personal." But it was personal. Trevor had been there from the very beginning, not as a fan, not as a casual companion, but as a true partner. And yet, little by little, Meghan was constructing a new life, one in which she no longer seemed to need him at all. The turning point arrived in the year 2011, when Meghan and Trevor finally married. It should have been the happiest day of their lives, a moment of celebration and joy. Instead, it became the first real sign that something was deeply amiss. The ceremony held in Jamaica was small, intimate, and beautiful on the surface, but to many who attended it felt strangely transactional. Friends later recalled that Meghan seemed distant, almost detached, approaching the occasion with a business-like demeanour, as though she were checking off a requirement rather than celebrating a union of love. Trevor dismissed the whispers, brushing aside concerns. He told himself they were simply stressed, caught in the whirlwind of planning. But in hindsight, many believe Meghan had already made her decision long before the vows were even spoken. The marriage lasted barely more than 2 years. And when it ended, It ended with a silence so cold and final that it stunned everyone who knew them. There was no heated fight, no dramatic confrontation, no plea for reconciliation. Meghan simply walked away. She mailed Trevor her wedding ring in an envelope. No explanation, no closure. Just 2 words implied in the act itself. It's over. To outsiders, it looked like an ordinary Hollywood split, 2 people on different career paths, slowly drifting apart. But for Trevor, it was far more sinister. Alongside the heartbreak came a crushing realization there were entire parts of Meghan's life that had been deliberately hidden from him, secrets carefully locked away. And one of those secrets, the one that would linger and torment him for years, was about the future family they were supposed to build together. Those close to Trevor say he had always envisioned having children. It was part of the dream part of the life he thought they were creating. He believed they had talked about it, or at least he thought they had. But each time he raised the subject, Meghan would deflect. Not now, she would say. The timing isn't right. At first, Trevor accepted her answers. But as time passed, the excuses grew stranger. The silences stretched longer. And then, one day, Trevor stumbled upon something that shattered his understanding of their marriage. The details of that discovery remain unclear. Some whisper it was a medical document. Others insist it was a conversation he overheard by accident. Whatever the source, the impact was the same. Trevor walked away, believing that Meghan had concealed from him a critical truth, that having biological children might never have been possible. The betrayal cut deeper than words can describe. It was not solely about the medical reality. It was about trust. It was about constructing a future with someone who had never given him all the pieces to the puzzle. And though Trevor tried to move on with his life, the wound never fully closed. Years later, it has reopened raw and aching once again. Because now, Trevor watches Meghan step before the world as a devoted mother to Archie and Lilibet. He listens as she speaks passionately about the joys of motherhood and the struggles of raising children. And each time he cannot silence the memory of the conversations that never took place, the words she avoided, the truths she may have hidden, the foundation of their marriage that was never what it seemed. And here is the part that twists the knife even deeper. Meghan never once looked back. Not for a moment. After the divorce, she all but erased Trevor from her story. In interviews, his name is rarely spoken, and on the rare occasions it does appear, it is delivered with an almost icy detachment, treating their marriage as little more than a passing footnote, a youthful error, a minor chapter before the real fairy tale began. But Trevor remembers everything. He remembers the late nights filled with whispered dreams. He remembers the shared ambitions, the quiet conversations about building a family together. And he remembers the silence, the kind of silence that now roars louder than ever, as Meghan's perfectly polished public image collides with the private reality he insists he once lived by her side. It is easy to forget Trevor Engelson. And that, it seems, is exactly what Meghan intended. But the truth is, this you cannot fully understand the woman she has become without first understanding the man she left behind. Trevor is not a villain in this story. He is not a bitter ex-husband clinging to the past. He is instead the ghost haunting the edges of the fairy tale, the one man who knew the truth before the rest of the world ever got a glimpse. And now that ghost has chosen to speak. But why now? Why reopen wounds long thought closed? Why risk unleashing a media storm by challenging one of the most polarising public figures alive today? According to those close to him, the answer lies in something far more explosive than a simple divorce story. Trevor's silence was not broken out of spite. It was not fuelled by revenge. It was broken by an incident, a single event so striking that it made him realise the truth he had been carrying for years was no longer his alone to hold. That truth was no longer just personal, it was public, and its consequences stretched far beyond the collapse of his marriage. That one event did more than shift Trevor's perception of Meghan. It changed the way the world itself might see her. And once you hear what happened, it will become clear why Trevor Engelson decided that his silence had to end. What happened next would not simply drag Meghan's hidden past into the open, it would shake the very foundation of the story she has spent her entire life so carefully constructing. And no one, not even Meghan herself, was prepared for the fallout. They say every love story has two sides, the version told to the world and the version that unfolds behind closed doors. Meghan Markle's first marriage was no exception. To the outside world, it seemed like the quintessential Hollywood romance, the determined producer and the ambitious young actress building their dreams together from the ground up. But behind the picture-perfect smiles, behind the curated red carpet poses and social media highlights, another story was quietly unravelling. A story that Trevor Engelson has for years only hinted at. A story not built on love and honesty, but on calculation, ambition and illusion. And what if this medical secret was never just a private matter, but in fact the key to understanding the entire Meghan Markle phenomenon? The irony is bitter and sharp. Meghan has spent years fighting tooth and nail for control of her narrative, taking on tabloids, suing powerful newspapers, and denouncing invasions of her privacy at every turn. And yet it was her own choices, her own omissions, that planted the seeds of the scandal, now threatening to consume her carefully built world. For Trevor, the discovery was more than a betrayal. It was a revelation, a key that unlocked the mystery of who Meghan truly is and why she acts the way she does. Because once you understand what she chose to hide from Trevor, you cannot help but wonder what else she has been hiding from everyone else. And that is why, for Trevor Engelson, silence eventually ceased to be an option. But if the medical file was the spark, the real explosion was still waiting. Because Meghan wasn't simply keeping the truth from Trevor. According to those closest to her, she was orchestrating a cover-up so meticulous, so deliberate, it could rival the best work of Hollywood's most skilled spin doctors. And once you see how far she was willing to go to keep that truth buried, you will understand why this story is nowhere near finished. What Meghan did next was not just about concealing a secret. It was about rewriting reality itself. And when the world finally saw the depth of that deception, the fallout was destined to be unlike anything the royal family or Meghan Markle herself had ever endured. Ask yourself this. How far would you go to conceal a truth that could obliterate everything you had built? Would you lie? Would you manipulate? Would you construct an entire identity designed to distract from the one truth you could never to allow to surface? For Meghan Markle, this question was never abstract. It was survival. And according to Trevor Engelson and those who witnessed her evolution up close, the lengths she went to in order to protect that medical reality were not simply strategic, they were ruthless. Because once she realised the truth about her body had the potential to derail her ambitions, Meghan didn't just bury it, she buried it under a mountain of flawlessly curated lies. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly small adjustments to her public image that seemed harmless at first. A few carefully crafted interviews here, a scattering of social media posts there, a handful of seemingly casual comments about one day wanting children. To the outside world, it looked like the natural progression of a young actress balancing her career aspirations with dreams of family life. But to Trevor, those words rang hollow. They were echoes of the same lines she had once used with him, the same evasions, the same vague promises now repackaged and polished for public consumption. And then it escalated. As Meghan's star began its sharp climb, her image grew more deliberate, more calculated, almost engineered. She brought on a new public relations team, one not merely skilled in managing reputations, but in manufacturing entire narratives from the ground up. They rebranded her, transforming her from a supporting actress into something far larger, an inspirational role model. Every interview, every photo shoot, every headline became part of a coordinated story. Meghan Markle, the woman who could truly have it all. A flourishing career, a powerful platform, a loving marriage, and one day, a family. The illusion was seamless. Fans adored the image, clinging to it as if it were gospel. Journalists eager for a feel-good narrative amplified it endlessly. Hollywood, forever hungry for figures who could be both aspirational and relatable, embraced it wholeheartedly. Meghan became the very definition of modern femininity. Ambitious yet nurturing, glamorous yet grounded, fierce yet family-centred. But to Trevor, the reality behind the curtain told a different tale. He watched as Meghan leaned heavily into motherhood-themed talking points, despite knowing, as he claims, that biological motherhood might never be her reality. He saw her take centre stage at charity events centred on maternal health, speaking passionately about family values. He even heard her casually joke in interviews about possible baby names. To Trevor, it was all performance art, and yet the audience bought every ticket. To be fair, there is nothing inherently wrong with ambition. There is nothing shameful about shaping a personal brand. But what made Meghan's campaign chilling to Trevor, what made it feel profoundly personal, was that it was not just ambition. It was history being rewritten in real time. It was uncomfortable truths buried beneath carefully crafted illusions. Nowhere was this more visible than in her dealings with the press. Journalists who dared probe into Meghan's private life were quickly frozen out. Tabloids that speculated about her future plans were threatened with legal action. Even close friends who raised the subject in private found themselves firmly told to let it go. Meghan didn't simply avoid the conversation, she erased it. It was as though the subject had never existed at all. At the same time, the story she did promote grew bolder with each step. She began to talk about motherhood not as a hope, but as an inevitability. She positioned herself as a woman who knew without doubt that one day she would be a mother. Yet those who had been closest to her, including Trevor, understood the situation was far more complicated. What she delivered was nothing short of a masterclass in image control. And in Hollywood, where perception often overshadows reality, it worked to perfection. Meghan was no longer simply an actress chasing roles. She had become a brand. And that brand, by her design, had to be flawless. But here is the problem with carefully constructed illusions: they demand constant upkeep. And when the cracks inevitably begin to appear, they spread quickly, threatening to collapse the entire facade. The first visible crack did not come from Trevor. It emerged from Meghan's own circle. Quietly in whispers behind closed doors, former friends and colleagues began to speak. Some claimed Meghan had confided in them about fertility struggles. Others suggested she had deliberately kept such struggles secret, even from those closest to her. No one possessed definitive proof yet. The contradictions steadily mounted. One former acquaintance recalled a moment when Meghan dismissed the idea of having children altogether, saying it was not part of the plan. Another remembered her discussing surrogacy as a possibility long before it became part of any public conversation. These snippets did not make headlines, at least not yet, but together they painted an unsettling picture, a woman quietly preparing for a future very different from the one she was presenting to the world. Meanwhile, Trevor stood on the sidelines, his frustration steadily growing. The woman he had once adored was now constructing an empire atop a foundation he believed was false. And the most painful part of all, the world embraced her for it. But Meghan was not content with simply reshaping how the public saw her. According to those close to her, she also moved decisively to erase any remnants of her past, including the marriage that had ended with such cold finality. Photographs disappeared from social media. Mentions of Trevor were scrubbed from interviews. Even longtime friends were quietly discouraged from ever bringing him up. By the time Meghan's royal romance with Prince Harry began to dominate the global stage, Trevor Engelson might as well have been erased from existence, and that was precisely her intention. Because Trevor was not just an ex-husband, he was living proof of a chapter. Meghan was determined the world must forget a chapter that contained the medical truth she had worked so hard to bury. As long as Trevor remained silent, her new narrative could flourish unchallenged. But there was one thing Meghan could never control: reality itself. No matter how polished the interviews, no matter how meticulously curated the brand, the truth always has a way of slipping through the cracks. And when it did, it threatened to undo everything she had built. It began subtly small inconsistencies, minor details that failed to align. Meghan's timeline of personal milestones seemed to shift ever so slightly depending on the interview. Stories about when she and Trevor first discussed the subject of children changed from one retelling to another. At first, these discrepancies went unnoticed. But for those who paid close attention, particularly members of the media, the contradictions grew too glaring to ignore. Then came the wave of speculation. Tabloids began openly questioning why Meghan, who had spoken so freely about the importance of family, had never addressed her fertility in any direct or transparent way. Anonymous sources started hinting at medical complications. Social media sleuths combed through old interviews, dissecting her every word in search of hidden clues. At first, the rumours were whispers, but those whispers were steadily growing louder. That was when Meghan's public relations machine roared into overdrive. Public appearances became more carefully choreographed than ever before. Meghan leaned heavily into imagery connected to family and motherhood. Cameras captured her cradling babies at charity events. She gave impassioned interviews about maternal empowerment and women's rights. The message beneath it all was unmistakable. I am a mother. I have always wanted to be a mother. There is no story here. It was a bold, aggressive strategy, and for a while it almost worked. But then something unexpected happened. The past Meghan had tried so carefully to bury began clawing its way back to the surface. Trevor, exhausted from watching his reality rewritten, began speaking quietly, cautiously about what had truly happened. He did not rush to the tabloids. He did not sit for glossy magazine interviews. Instead, he confided in people who knew the truth, people who could confirm it, people who had once stood close enough to witness the cracks themselves. And slowly, inevitably, those private conversations began to leak. At first, the whispers were dismissed as the bitterness of a jealous ex-husband. Meghan's public relations team was quick to discredit them before they could gain momentum. But the more Trevor spoke, the more the whispers grew and the more people began to listen. Because this was not a man inventing fictions. This was a man recounting a life he had lived. And then, as if fate itself decided the time for silence had ended, an incident occurred, something so public, so visible, that Meghan could no longer deflect it. To this day, the details remain hazy. But whatever it was, it forced the issue. It pulled every carefully buried question back into the spotlight. It compelled the media to revisit stories they had once dismissed. It made royal watchers connect dots they had previously overlooked. And for Trevor, it was the final confirmation that staying silent was no longer shielding anyone, not even the truth. Because if Meghan was willing to build an entire global identity on a foundation of half-truths, then what else might she be capable of hiding? At that point, this was no longer about fertility alone. It had become a matter of authenticity, integrity, and trust. And as the glossy Hollywood facade began to crack, what lay beneath was far more shocking than anyone had imagined. Because what Trevor uncovered next did not only reveal the truth about Meghan's medical history, it exposed the extraordinary lengths of deception she was willing to orchestrate to keep it hidden. And that deception did not stop in Hollywood. It followed her all the way to Buckingham Palace, for when the story resurfaced, it did not appear in a film studio or a gossip magazine. It exploded at the very heart of the British monarchy, and it threatened to transform Meghan Markle's royal fairy tale into a scandal of historic proportions. But the letter that arrived soon after, the one Trevor never imagined he would ever lay eyes on again, would take the scandal to a level no one could have foreseen. And once it was opened, there would be no turning back. Sometimes the past does not haunt you with a scream. Sometimes it slips back into your life, quietly tucked neatly inside a plain white envelope, carrying words you once believed you would never read again. That was how it happened for Trevor Engelson. Years after the marriage had dissolved, long after the heartbreak had dulled into something closer to acceptance, Meghan reappeared in his world in the most unlikely way through a letter. It wasn't long, it wasn't emotional or dramatic, but it was powerful not because of the words on the page, but because of what those words revealed. By the time the letter found him, Trevor had convinced himself he had moved on. He had rebuilt his career, found happiness again, and carved out a life that seemed far removed from the shadow of Meghan Markle. Of course, the scars lingered, the unanswered questions, the deep betrayal, the memory of the medical file he could never erase. But those wounds had been buried beneath the everyday noise of a new life, one no longer defined by her absence. And then, one morning, it appeared his name, written in a familiar hand he had not seen in years, and a return address he recognised instantly, Meghan. For a long moment, he considered leaving it unopened. What good could possibly come from dragging the past back into the present? But curiosity, that same restless instinct that had once made him question the strange gaps in their marriage, took hold. He tore the envelope open, and what he read stopped him cold. The letter was not an apology. It was not a plea for forgiveness. It was not some desperate attempt to rekindle what had been lost. It was something else entirely. Something that on the surface appeared almost mundane, yet carried enormous weight between the lines. Meghan wrote about her journey, about how life had taken her in directions neither of them could have imagined, about how certain truths were simply too heavy to share at the time. That single line, too heavy to share at the time, hit Trevor like a strike to the chest. It was the closest she had ever come to admitting what he had long suspected, that she had deliberately kept critical truths from him. That the woman with whom he had built a marriage had chosen secrecy over honesty, and that the medical reality he had stumbled upon years before had never been a misunderstanding. It had been intentional. It had been a secret. It had been a choice. She never spelt it out. Meghan was far too careful for that. Instead, her words were meticulously chosen, layered with subtext and ambiguity. It was as if she wanted to acknowledge the past without ever confronting it directly, to nod at the truth, without daring to actually name it. Trevor sat with the letter for hours, reading and rereading every line, dissecting each phrase. Every sentence felt like a puzzle piece. Every omission felt like a clue. And it wasn't just what she wrote, it was what she deliberately left unsaid. There was no mention of the medical file, no acknowledgement of the lies, no apology for the betrayal. It was classic Meghan, carefully controlled, deliberately vague, designed to preserve her image while maintaining just enough vulnerability to appear sincere. But then there was the one sentence that stood out above all the rest, the one that would echo in Trevor's mind for years to come. We both know there are things I couldn't give you. On the surface, it was simple, almost innocuous. Yet, in those words, Trevor heard everything she had avoided, saying everything she had denied. It wasn't just about children. It was about trust, about the foundation of their relationship, about the future they might have had together, and the one that never came to be. In that moment, staring at those words, Trevor realised something crucial. Meghan had not written the letter for him. She had written it for herself. This was not closure. This was absolution. Another chance to rewrite history, this time on her terms once again. But the letter did something else too. It reignited feelings Trevor believed had long since died, the anger, the sense of betrayal, the deep injustice of it all. Because while Meghan was thriving, reinventing herself on a global stage and basking in adoration, he was still carrying the weight of the truth alone. He had respected her privacy. He had remained silent. And in return, she had erased him from her story while building an empire on the very lie that had destroyed their marriage. That was the moment Trevor made his decision. He would not stay silent any longer. The letter itself wasn't the catalyst, it was the final straw. Because soon after it arrived, a series of events unfolded that thrust Meghan's past back into the harsh light of public scrutiny. And suddenly, the details Trevor had buried, the ones he had once sworn to keep private, were becoming relevant again. The world was asking questions that only he could answer. But before we reach that turning point, it is important to understand why Meghan sent the letter when she did. This was not random. Meghan never did anything without purpose. According to those close to her, the timing was no coincidence. Around the very moment she sent Trevor that letter, Meghan was preparing to step into a brand new chapter of her public life, one centred almost entirely around motherhood. There were speeches, there were carefully crafted interviews. There were strategic leaks to the press about family planning. Many now believe the letter was Meghan's way of tying up loose ends before they could unravel. A preemptive strike, a way to neutralise a potential threat before it had the chance to become a problem. But it had the opposite effect. Instead of offering closure, the letter ripped open wounds Trevor thought had long since scarred over. Instead of burying the truth, it reignited his determination to make sure it was known. And as Meghan's public image became increasingly polished, increasingly managed, Trevor's silence became harder and harder to justify. Because at the very core of Meghan's story lay a contradiction no amount of public relations could erase. How could a woman who, according to Trevor, once struggled with the possibility of motherhood, now present herself to the world as the embodiment of maternal perfection? How could someone who allegedly concealed critical truths about her fertility now speak of motherhood as if it had always been her destiny? The hypocrisy gnawed at Trevor. And the more he turned it over in his mind, the more he realised this truth wasn't just his story. It was her story too, and it was a part of that story the world had every right to know. The letter, in many ways, was Meghan's attempt to rewrite their shared history one final time. But what she hadn't accounted for was Trevor's refusal to let her do it. Because if Meghan was determined to build a global identity on half-truths, then Trevor would finally tell the other half, and soon he would get his chance. For not long after that letter arrived, something happened. An event that forced Trevor's hand, a public moment, a statement, a controversy that thrust Meghan's version of events under the harshest spotlight it had ever faced. And when that moment came, Trevor realised he was holding information that could change the conversation entirely. This was no longer just about a marriage that had ended. It was no longer about a letter tucked inside an envelope. It was about the truth itself, and what would happen when that truth collided head-on with Meghan Markle's carefully crafted image. With the weight of that letter still pressing on his conscience, Trevor made a choice that would alter everything. He would speak. He would reveal what he knew. And when he did, the world would never see Meghan Markle the same way again. But before he could step into the light, one more event pushed him past the point of no return. An incident so shocking, so deeply personal, that it left even Meghan's closest allies questioning everything they thought they knew. And when that incident broke into the headlines, there was no pulling it back. Because once the truth came out, it wouldn't just dent Meghan's reputation, it would shake the very foundation of the royal narrative itself. And no one, not Meghan, not Harry, not even the palace walls of Buckingham, would be prepared for what followed. Every story has a breaking point, A moment when the secrets, the lies, the perfectly constructed illusions can no longer hold together. For Trevor Engelson, that breaking point didn't arrive in the quiet aftermath of his divorce. It didn't come when he first stumbled upon the medical file. It didn't even come when Meghan's carefully worded letter arrived years later. It came with an incident so public, so humiliating, that it ripped the scab off every wound he had tried to bury. And in that moment, Trevor knew silence was no longer an option. The incident did not unfold in private, hidden away from the world. It happened under blinding lights on a stage watched by millions across the globe. Meghan Markle was front and centre at a high-profile charity gala, an event dedicated to women's health empowerment and, with cruel irony, motherhood. Clad in a flawless white suit and radiating confidence, the Duchess stepped up to the microphone and delivered a speech that would dominate headlines for days. But it wasn't the event itself that shook Trevor to his core. It was her words. Motherhood. Meghan declared, her voice ringing with conviction, and carefully measured emotion has been the greatest gift of my life. It is the most profound experience any woman can have, and it is something every woman deserves to experience in her own way. The audience erupted in thunderous applause. The press would later describe the address as inspirational, heartfelt, even transformative, a love letter to mothers everywhere. Social media platforms lit up in praise. Meghan Markle was once again being celebrated as the embodiment of modern maternal grace. But when Trevor watched the replay that evening, his stomach churned. It wasn't jealousy, it wasn't bitterness, it was something far deeper, a feeling of utter betrayal. Because here, standing before millions, was the woman who, according to him, had hidden critical truths about her own fertility, now positioning herself as the global voice of motherhood. Here was the woman who had once shut down every private conversation about children, now proclaiming to the world that motherhood was the pinnacle of a woman's existence. To Trevor, it wasn't just hypocrisy. It was gaslighting. It was watching someone rewrite history in real time, erasing the reality they had lived together, and replacing it with a polished, media-approved illusion. What made it even harder to stomach was the way Meghan framed her narrative. She spoke vaguely, almost artfully, about the struggle she had overcome, just enough detail to seem authentic, but never enough to reveal anything real. It was storytelling at its most strategic, vulnerable enough to win, sympathy calculated enough to hide the truth. Trevor felt his fist tighten as she spoke. To him, it wasn't merely a lie to the world. It was a lie to herself. And in the process, it erased his story, their story, altogether. But that speech was only the beginning. A week later, Meghan appeared on one of the biggest talk shows in the world. The interview was teased for days, promising raw honesty and personal revelations. Once again, the conversation turned to motherhood. Meghan smiled warmly as she described how she had always dreamed of being a mother, how she had wanted children since she was a little girl. She even laughed as she recalled an intimate conversation she claimed to have had with Harry early in their relationship about how many children they wanted together. For Trevor, that was the breaking point. He knew it wasn't true. He remembered the silences, the evasions, the abrupt subject changes whenever the idea of children arose. He remembered the file. He remembered the truth. And now, watching Meghan present a completely fabricated version of that truth to a global audience, something inside him finally snapped. It was never about revenge. It was never about bitterness. For Trevor, it was about justice, not only for himself, but for the truth. Because the version of events Meghan was selling to the world wasn't merely incomplete. It was fiction. And so Trevor did the one thing he had promised himself he would never do. He spoke. At first it was quiet, just a conversation with a trusted friend, someone who knew them both well. But one conversation led to another, and then another. And before long, whispers began to circulate Trevor Engelson. Meghan Markle's ex-husband had a story to tell, and it was not the story Meghan had been selling. The timing could not have been more explosive. Meghan and Harry were in the middle of a global media blitz promoting their new documentary, a project billed as raw and unfiltered, a chance to finally set the record straight. But Trevor's truth painted a radically different picture. And then came the inevitable. A journalist one, who had quietly been investigating Meghan's past for years, reached out to Trevor. They met in private. At first, Trevor was wary. He had no interest in gossip or tabloid theatrics. He didn't want his name splashed across screaming headlines. But as the conversation deepened, Trevor realised the journalist wasn't chasing cheap scandal. They were after something more. They were after the truth. And for the first time, Trevor opened up about the medical file, about the lies, about the betrayal that had never healed. What he revealed didn't just challenge Meghan's public narrative. It shattered it. The journalist's report didn't detail the specifics of the medical file, but it did contain one explosive quote attributed directly to Trevor. There were things Meghan wasn't honest about, things that would have changed everything if I had known. That single line was enough to spark a global media firestorm. Headlines screamed about hidden secrets and undisclosed truths. Social media lit up with speculation. And suddenly, Meghan's carefully curated image, the perfect mother, the perfect wife, the flawless woman, was under siege. The palace, as always, refused to comment. Meghan's team dismissed the story as fiction and malicious. But the damage was done. A seed of doubt had been planted, and it began to spread quickly. And then came the true explosion. A second voice stepped forward, this time a former mutual friend of Meghan and Trevor. They corroborated key pieces of Trevor's account, claiming Meghan had confided in them about fertility struggles during her marriage struggles she had deliberately concealed from her husband. Suddenly, this wasn't just Trevor's word against Meghan's. There were corroborating witnesses. The puzzle pieces were starting to align, and once they did, Meghan's royal fairy tale no longer looked untouchable. It looked like it was beginning to unravel. And as the story gathered momentum, something unexpected began to unfold. People didn't just question Meghan's words about motherhood, they started questioning everything else. If she had been dishonest about something as fundamental, as intimate as the ability to have children, what else had she misled the world about? Had the royal family been deceived? Had the public been duped? Had Harry himself been kept in the dark? The questions were relentless, echoing across headlines and social media feeds, and for the first time in years, Meghan didn't seem to have the answers. But the most devastating blow had yet to land, because just as the media frenzy reached its boiling point, a document surfaced, one that insiders claimed confirmed critical details of Trevor's story. It hadn't come from Trevor. It hadn't been intended for public eyes. But once it leaked, there was no way to put the genie back in the bottle. The document, reportedly part of Meghan's old medical records, dating back to years before she had ever met Harry, did not reveal everything. But what it did contain was damning enough references to fertility complications, phrased in language hauntingly similar to what Trevor had described. Meghan's team immediately denied its authenticity, but the timing was impossible to ignore. The backlash was swift and merciless. Meghan's supporters rushed to her defence, condemning the leaks as invasive, sexist, a violation of her privacy. Her critics, however, seized on the revelations, accusing her of manipulation, deception, and years of calculated dishonesty. The royal family, true to form, remained silent. But behind closed doors, sources whispered of shockwaves rippling through Buckingham Palace, whispers of private conversations and frantic damage control. For Trevor, it was a bittersweet reckoning. On one hand, the truth, or at least fragments of it, had finally been dragged into the light. On the other, it meant reliving the most painful chapter of his past, a chapter he had once hoped would stay buried. But there was no retreat now. The story had slipped beyond anyone's control, and it was rewriting Meghan's legacy in real time. Because now, this was no longer just about Meghan's past. It was about her present, her credibility, her reputation, her future. And as the carefully constructed walls of her public persona began to crack and crumble, one truth became impossible to deny. The world would never look at Meghan Markle the same way again. But the fallout didn't stop there. The incident didn't just reopen old wounds. It triggered something larger, something far more dangerous, an avalanche of speculation and scrutiny that threatened to engulf not just Meghan, but the monarchy itself. Because the revelation that Meghan might not have been honest about her fertility was only the beginning. The next chapter would raise questions, even more explosive questions, about her children, about her marriage, about the royal lineage itself. And when those questions began splashing across the front pages, the British monarchy found itself staring down a crisis unlike any it had faced in decades. And it all began with that single incident, the spark that lit the fuse. But what came next, the bombshell Trevor dropped, would make that spark look like nothing more than a firecracker. Because in one single sentence, just a handful of words, he would say something that shook the foundations of the royal story itself. And once he said it, there would be no going back. There are moments in history when a single sentence has the power to fracture empires. One phrase spoken at the right time in the right place can cut through decades of silence and rewrite everything we thought we knew. For Meghan Markle, and for the royal institution she had married into that moment, arrived when Trevor Engelson, the man who once knew her better than anyone, finally broke his silence with a statement so devastating, so deeply personal, that the world stopped cold. And he didn't deliver it in a sensational tabloid outburst. He didn't leak it in a bitter, rage-filled interview. He said it quietly, calmly, almost clinically. But the weight of it was greater than any scream. She can't give birth. 5 words. That was all. But they landed like a nuclear blast. It was the line no one had ever expected to hear the accusation. Even Meghan's harshest critics had never dared to voice in public. And it wasn't simply a challenge to her honesty. It was a strike at the very heart of her identity, in her image as a mother. The backlash was instant and ferocious. Social media erupted into chaos. News outlets splashed the claim across their front pages. Trevor Engelson says Meghan can't have children. Ex-husband's bombshell allegation rocks the royal family. Explosive statement threatens Meghan's public image. Television panels debated the ethics of exposing something so intimate. Royal commentators speculated endlessly about its implications. Was Trevor telling the truth? Was this revenge disguised as revelation, or was there a darker, more complex story waiting to be uncovered? And then came the silence, the loudest silence of all. Meghan didn't respond, Harry didn't respond, Buckingham Palace didn't respond. Even Meghan's inner circle, the allies who normally rushed to her defence at the first sign of controversy, suddenly had nothing to say. And in that silence, the world found its own answer. What made Trevor's claim so devastating wasn't just the content, it was the context. For years, Meghan had placed motherhood at the very centre of her narrative. She had spoken with passion about the miracle of pregnancy. She had called Archie and Lilibet blessings beyond measure. She had built her platform, her causes, her public image around championing mothers and children everywhere. Motherhood wasn't just part of Meghan Markle's story, it was her story. And now, in just 5 words, the one man who had known her before the cameras, before the palace, before the crown, had called that story into question. Of course, Trevor's words alone didn't prove anything. Medical realities are rarely that simple, and infertility is not a black and white condition. But Trevor's statement was never intended to serve as a clinical diagnosis. It was a bombshell, designed to force a conversation, a direct strike at Meghan's narrative, a demand that the world look past the polished public relations and confront the uncomfortable questions lurking beneath. And those questions came quickly, multiplying by the hour. If Meghan truly couldn't give birth, what did that mean for the royal lineage? Had the royal family known? Were the children born through surrogacy? If so, why had neither the palace nor Meghan ever addressed it openly? Had the public, and perhaps even history itself, been misled about something as fundamental as the birth of royal heirs? Speculation grew louder with every news cycle. Commentators began poring over photographs from Meghan's pregnancies, dissecting them frame by frame. They re-examined old interviews, studied her public appearances, even scrutinised the exact wording of official palace announcements. Suddenly, details once dismissed as trivial seemed ominous. Why had Meghan's baby bumps appeared to fluctuate so strangely? Why were there so few credible hospital sightings surrounding the births? Why had Archie's birth certificate originally contained unusual omissions? Questions that had once lived. Only in obscure corners of royal gossip forums were now splashed across the front pages of the world's biggest newspapers. And Trevor's 5 words had given those questions legitimacy. What stunned observers most, however, wasn't the claim itself, it was the way Trevor delivered it. He didn't sound vengeful. He didn't sound enraged. He sounded weary, broken, like a man who had carried a truth too heavy for too long. In that quiet, tired tone, many heard something that felt authentic. He's not trying to ruin her, one insider confided to a journalist. He's trying to stop her from continuing to rewrite history. The public was sharply divided. Some accused Trevor of cruelty of crossing an unforgivable line by exposing something so personal. Others argued Meghan had invited such scrutiny by making motherhood the cornerstone of her brand. If she built her image on this one, commentator remarked she can't be surprised when people question it. And then came the twist no one expected. Former associates of Meghan people from her Hollywood years who had stayed silent until now began stepping into the conversation. Some echoed Trevor's claims, saying Meghan had spoken privately of fertility struggles long before she ever met Prince Harry. Others hinted that surrogacy had always been part of her plan. None produced hard evidence, but their words added kerosene to an already raging fire. The narrative Meghan had fought to control was slipping out of her hands, and it was Trevor's 5 words that had opened the floodgates. The palace, meanwhile, slipped into full-blown crisis mode. Behind gilded doors, officials debated furiously over how to respond. Some argued for a forceful denial, a statement designed to shut down the rumours once and for all. Others warned that any acknowledgement, even a denial, would only lend the allegations more weight. In the end, they chose silence. But that silence carried a heavy price. It created a vacuum, and in that vacuum, speculation flourished unchecked. The narrative, once tightly controlled by Meghan, was suddenly beyond her grasp. And then, as though fate had more to deliver, a revelation even more devastating surfaced. A journalist, combing through dusty court archives, stumbled upon references to a sealed legal dispute involving Meghan and a former medical clinic. The case, according to anonymous insiders, was linked to fertility treatments. The documents themselves were vague, redacted beyond recognition, but the mere existence of such a dispute was enough to reignite the firestorm. Suddenly the questions grew sharper. It was no longer just about whether Meghan could give birth. It became about what she knew when she knew it, and why she had never been transparent. As fragments of evidence accumulated, a new picture began to form, one that cast Meghan not as the victim of cruel gossip, but as the orchestrator of her own narrative. A master manipulator who had spent years keeping the truth buried. And still, Meghan said nothing. Days slipped into weeks, weeks stretched into months. Yet the headlines refused to die down. Every time the controversy seemed to fade Trevor's 5 words, She can't give birth resurfaced like an echo. They became more than a statement. They became a cultural flashpoint, a rallying cry for those who doubted the Sussexes, and a symbol of the growing rift between Meghan's carefully constructed image and the public's trust. For Trevor, the fallout was bittersweet. He had never intended to ignite a global scandal. He hadn't set out to start a cultural war. All he had wanted was acknowledgement that the story Meghan was presenting to the world was not the one he had lived. But once those words escaped his lips, they grew wings of their own. And in their flight, they carried a question so heavy it rattled even the marble halls of Buckingham Palace. If Meghan had misled the public about this, what else had she hidden? The implications were staggering. Royal analysts began openly speculating about the line of succession. Legal experts debated whether undisclosed surrogacy, if proven, could complicate matters of royal inheritance. Historians reached back through the centuries, drawing comparisons to royal scandals that had once brought the monarchy itself to the brink. And through it all, one reality became impossible to ignore. Trevor's 5 words had done far more than expose a personal truth. They had torn a jagged hole through the image. Meghan and Harry had so carefully built an image of authenticity, of vulnerability, of living your truth. Because if Meghan hadn't been living her truth, then whose truth had the world been believing all along? But the story was far from finished. Because just as the world was reeling from Trevor's revelation, another shockwave struck, one that didn't come from him or from tabloid journalists or from nameless insiders feeding the rumour mill. This one came from inside Meghan's own circle. Someone who had seen the documents, who had heard the private conversations, who claimed to know the truth firsthand. And unlike the whispers that came before, this testimony wasn't easily dismissed as speculation. It was personal, it was specific, and it was devastating. When that person finally spoke, the narrative shifted once more. No longer just scandal, no longer even crisis, but catastrophe. Because their words didn't merely back Trevor's claim, they pushed it further, much further. They suggested Meghan hadn't only hidden the truth. She had deliberately woven a web of deception designed to ensure that no one would ever uncover it. And once that allegation went public, even her most loyal defenders were left asking the one question Meghan had spent her entire life trying to avoid: what else has she been hiding? It's one thing when an ex-husband steps forward. The public expects a measure of bitterness, the sting of resentment, maybe even exaggeration. But when the people who once defended you, those who stood by your side, who celebrated your victories, who swore loyalty and discretion, begin to break their silence, that is when the ground truly begins to shake. And for Meghan Markle, that was exactly what happened next.